The desert night settles like a velvet curtain, soft and shimmering, over the glowing strip of 1963's Glitter Town, a place where fortunes rise and fall with the casual flick of a wrist. Neon lights pulse in slow breaths, painting the silence with hues of rose, amber, and cold electric blue. It is a city that pretends to never sleep, yet beneath the bright facade lies a heart that beats quietly, cautiously, always watching. And somewhere within that glowing labyrinth walks a man whose presence seems almost ghost-like, a figure who moves with the calm certainty of someone who knows more than he ever says. His name is Vincent Caravetta, but the city knows him by another name, one spoken softly, with a mixture of respect, gratitude, and a thread of fear, the Dice King. He is not the owner of any casino, nor the head of any official organization. He holds no grand title, no publicly recognized authority. Yet the most powerful men in the desert, mob captains, casino bosses, performers with names in lights, pause when he enters a room. They lower their voices, tilt their heads, adjust their expectations. Vincent is the man they call when things begin to unravel, when tension builds beneath the glamorous surface, when Glitter Town's fragile balance trembles under the weight of ambition. If a deal needs smoothing, a temper needs cooling, or a secret needs burying, he is the quiet hand that restores order. Tonight, he steps out from the shadows of a towering casino canopy, the glow of the sign catching the silver threads in his tie. His suit is tailored but understated, his posture relaxed yet purposeful. Nothing about him demands attention, yet everything about him draws the eye. People who speak of him always mention that paradox: he looks like no one, but feels like everyone is aware of him. His presence is a whisper in a world made of noise. The hour is late, though time feels irrelevant in a city built to resist the natural rhythm of day and night. The streets hum with the muffled melody of distant music and quiet footsteps on heated pavement. A soft breeze brushes across the casino corridor, carrying with it the mingled scents of cigarettes, perfume, and desert dust. It is here, in this moment suspended between excitement and exhaustion, that the truth of Glitter Town reveals itself, not as a place of constant thrill, but as a fragile illusion stitched together by men like Vincent who understand that harmony is not accidental. For years, he has moved behind the scenes, nurturing the delicate ecosystem of gamblers, celebrities, fixers, and organized power players who rely on the city's survival. Some call him a mediator. Others, a strategist. But the word that fits best, whispered by those closest to the heartbeat of the strip, is fixer. Not because he repairs broken things, but because he knows how to prevent them from breaking in the first place. A misplaced bet, a feud between visiting VIPs, a sudden shortage of high-quality dice, a performer's scandal threatening to reach the papers, Vincent absorbs these problems like the desert absorbs the fading heat after sundown. As he walks along the polished floors of the casino lobby, he nods politely at a cocktail waitress who recognizes him. Her smile softens, his presence has that effect. Dealers greet him with the faintest tilt of their heads, pit bosses with a firm but respectful glance. They all know he is not technically part of their hierarchy. Yet they treat him like a guardian of the unseen rules, the man who ensures that tonight will pass smoothly, and tomorrow will come without chaos. But what makes Vincent's story remarkable is not simply the influence he wields. It is the mystery surrounding how he came to possess such calm power. Most men who hold sway in Glitter Town wear their history loudly, bragging about past exploits, flashing the scars that prove their toughness, recounting their violent rises to the top. Vincent, however, reveals nothing. He offers no grand stories of conquest, no tales of intimidation. He speaks softly, chooses his words with care, and listens far more than he talks. Some say he understands probabilities better than any man alive. Others claim he can read a room with the accuracy of a seasoned detective. A few insist he has friends in places no one dares to mention. Whatever the truth, it has shaped him into a figure of quiet authority. Tonight, as he pauses near the dice table, he watches the players with serene attentiveness. The sound of dice hitting felt is gentle, rhythmic, a subtle percussion beneath the casino's distant music. A young gambler celebrates a small win, laughter erupting from his friends. Vincent smiles faintly, appreciating the moment. But he also notices the dealer's nervous glance toward a supervisor, the slight tension in a pit boss's jaw, the way a certain gentleman at the corner table watches the proceedings too closely. He reads these signs the way others read newspaper headlines. Something is off. Something small, but in Glitter Town, even the smallest imbalance can ripple outward, disturbing far more than a single game. And this is where his story begins, not with violence, not with spectacle, but with a quiet man observing a world of glitter and shadows. A man whose talents will soon be tested by forces he cannot yet see. A man who will rise not through aggression, but through intellect, patience, and an almost mystical ability to hold a city's fate in the palm of his hand. Tonight, Glitter Town shines as brightly as ever. But beneath its brilliance lies a brewing tension, a subtle shift waiting to unfold. And Vincent, Dice King, Caravetta, stepping calmly through the neon haze, senses the change long before anyone else. The desert of Nevada does not forgive easily, yet it has a strange way of shaping the people who grow up in its shadow. Vincent Caravetta's origins began far from the sparkling lights he would one day influence, in a quiet stretch of Henderson Row where houses sat low and unassuming against endless open land. The nights there were colder, the winds sharper, and the silence thicker than anything he would later encounter in Glitter Town. His childhood unfolded in this sparse landscape, a place where time seemed to linger, stretching itself across long summers and quiet winters until every memory softened into stillness. His family lived modestly, making do with whatever work came their way, odd jobs for his father, small sewing contracts for his mother, and long days when money felt more like a rumor than a reality. But there was warmth inside the Caravetta home, a resilience that settled into the walls. Vincent grew up watching his parents stretch every resource with quiet determination, never complaining, never surrendering to despair. They taught him early that calm thinking could survive even the harshest seasons, that a steady mind was stronger than the loudest voice. These lessons slid into his character without force, becoming part of the quiet armor he would one day rely upon. As a boy, Vincent had a fascination with numbers that puzzled those around him. While other children built forts or chased stray dogs down dusty roads, he spent his free time drawing grids in the dirt, practicing additions and patterns that seemed to form melodies only he could hear. He would sit cross-legged outside for hours, watching the play of sunlight on gravel and calculating odd sequences just to see where they led. His teachers called him gifted, though the word meant little in a place where opportunities were scarce and dreams often stopped at the county line. Life in Henderson Row moved slowly, with predictable rhythms that lulled the community into a sense of peaceful continuity. Yet there were moments that hinted at the world beyond the town's edges. Travelers occasionally passed through, gamblers heading west, miners relocating, drifters with stories lined into their faces. They spoke of places where fortunes could turn overnight, where music played louder, and where the night never fully slept. Vincent listened carefully, absorbing their tales without revealing the growing curiosity beneath his steady demeanor. One afternoon when he was 12, Vincent encountered a card sharp resting in the shade outside the general store. The man demonstrated a few simple tricks, shuffles, cuts, false deals, nothing elaborate, but enough to leave an impression. Vincent did not marvel the way other children did. Instead, he watched the man's hands with analytical intensity, noting how they moved, when they tightened, when they relaxed. Something in those motions felt familiar, aligned with the mental patterns he already loved exploring. It was the first time he realized that numbers could be alive, shaping outcomes in ways that went beyond the page. His adolescence mirrored the desert weather, calm stretches interrupted by sudden heat or unexpected storms. The Caravetta family worked hard, and Vincent contributed where he could, delivering supplies, watching younger cousins, helping mend fences or sweep out sheds. Every job taught him patience, discipline, and the subtle art of reading people. A man might accuse you of slacking, but his eyes revealed exhaustion more than anger. Another might smile while handing over payment, though his fingers trembled with anxiety. Vincent learned to observe quietly, to piece together truths others overlooked. Though his world was small, he never felt trapped. The desert horizon, vast and unbroken, suggested possibilities rather than limits. At night, he would lie on the roof of his family's house, feeling the wind cool against his cheeks as he watched the constellations drift overhead. The quiet was deep enough to drown in, but instead of feeling lonely, he found comfort in it. The stars hinted at motion beyond his immediate life, the promise that change, though distant, was slowly making its way toward him. By the time he reached 16, gas stations along the highway had begun to fill with travelers heading toward the expanding metropolis of Las Vegas. The Strip was still young, more glitter than polish, but its reputation reached even the quiet corners of Henderson Row. Rumors spread of new casinos rising overnight, of entertainers arriving from faraway cities, of high-risk games where money moved like water. Vincent listened with growing curiosity, imagining crowds, noise, and bright lights replacing the familiar calm of his small town. Yet despite these whispers of change, Vincent's early years remained grounded in humility. He walked the same dusty roads, greeted neighbors with steady politeness, and maintained a quiet composure that made him seem older than his age. But whenever he looked out at the distant glow on the horizon, where the sky faintly reflected the newborn lights of the Strip, a mysterious pull formed within him. It was not excitement or fear, more like recognition, as if the future was quietly calling his name. He did not yet know what role he would play in that distant world, nor how deeply it would shape his life, but he sensed that his path would someday diverge from the familiar routines of Henderson Row. Each year, the glow on the horizon grew brighter, a reminder that opportunity was inching closer. And as he continued helping his family and observing the quiet subtleties of human behavior, a foundation was forming within him. The desert was teaching him to think slowly, to notice details others rushed past, preparing him for a world that would challenge him in ways he never. The casino floors of early 1950s Las Vegas were nothing like the glittering spectacle they would later become. Back then, the Strip felt like a rough draft of the city it wanted to be, bright but unpolished, glamorous but gritty around the edges. Neon signs flickered more often, carpets wore thin patches from constant traffic, and the air held a raw mixture of cigarette smoke, sweat, and ambition. This was the world Vincent entered as a teenager, stepping into a future neither he nor the city yet understood. Everything felt unfinished, full of possibility, and quietly dangerous. And from the moment he first walked through those casino doors, something inside him shifted. He started with the simplest jobs, work no one else wanted to do. Bellhop shifts that lasted into the early hours of the morning, sweeping late-night corridors, carrying luggage up creaking staircases, and running chips between tables when the pit bosses needed an extra hand. At first, he kept his head down, moving silently through the noise. Yet even as he performed these mundane tasks, he could not help observing. The casino was a living creature, and every person inside played a role in its heartbeat. Dealers moved with deliberate precision, gamblers carried invisible storms inside their eyes, and floor managers controlled tension with subtle gestures that could change the atmosphere of an entire room. It didn't take long before Vincent began to feel the rhythm of the space, recognizing patterns others overlooked. He noticed that a dealer who blinked too slowly was tired and more likely to make mistakes. A gambler shifting weight from one foot to the other might be building the courage for a reckless bet. The soft click of chips stacking in a certain rhythm meant a regular was getting restless. These tiny details fascinated him, not because he wished to manipulate them, but because they revealed so much about human nature, and about how fragile control truly was. During slow hours, he lingered near the craps tables, pretending to tidy while watching the dice tumble across the felt. He studied angles, the spin of a wrist, the subtle difference between a casual throw and an intentional one. Probability wasn't just numbers on a chalkboard anymore, it lived in the casino's pulse. It moved through the air like a hidden current, connecting every decision to every outcome. The more he watched, the more he understood that luck was not as wild or unpredictable as people believed. There were always patterns, always signs hidden behind the noise. One evening, while delivering a tray to a private lounge, Vincent overheard two seasoned dealers discussing weighted dice. Their conversation was quiet, almost secretive, but Vincent caught enough to piece together the idea: small alterations, barely visible, that could shift odds without drawing suspicion. He felt neither excitement nor temptation, only curiosity. Why did some players cheat the system? Why did some casinos let small infractions slide? Who decided what had to be exposed and what could be ignored for the sake of maintaining peace? The questions lingered in his mind long after his shift ended. Around this time, a man named Raymond, an older pit boss with silver hair and a cautious smile, took notice of the quiet teenager who watched everything. At first, he simply allowed Vincent to shadow him after hours, explaining the unspoken rules of the casino floor. But soon he realized that Vincent absorbed information like desert sand absorbs heat. The boy did not merely listen, he understood. He recognized tension before it escalated, noticed irregularities before they became problems, and seemed to predict trouble with uncanny accuracy. Raymond began giving him small tasks: calming down a frustrated gambler with a free drink, discreetly escorting a suspicious visitor out before security became involved, checking dice trays for minor inconsistencies. These tasks were simple on the surface, but each carried an implicit trust. And each one Vincent completed with the same composure he had carried since childhood. One night, while helping reorganize backroom logs, Vincent discovered that the casino's internal books did not quite match the official reports. Nothing dramatic, just subtle discrepancies, small enough to be brushed aside. When he pointed it out to Raymond, the older man studied him for a moment before admitting the truth: the casino sometimes allowed certain adjustments to keep powerful guests happy. "This place looks clean from the outside," Raymond said softly, "but everything here depends on balance. If one part tilts, the whole thing can fall." Vincent didn't respond immediately. He simply absorbed the idea, feeling a deeper understanding settle into him. Balance, not winning, not power, was the true cornerstone of the casino world. And maintaining that balance required calm minds and careful decisions. Months passed, and Vincent's role grew naturally, almost invisibly. He remained a teenager on payroll, but employees began seeking his input during chaotic moments. If a dealer panicked, they called Vincent. If a gambler accused the house of cheating, security waited for his assessment before acting. He was still young, still learning, yet already becoming essential, because he could sense tension long before it became visible. The moment that solidified his quiet rise came late on a crowded Saturday night. A visiting wealthy gambler claimed the dice were off, slamming his fist against the table and drawing a crowd. The pit boss hesitated, uncertain whether the man was drunk, angry, or genuinely suspicious. Before anyone could intervene, Vincent stepped forward softly, examining the dice with steady hands. He determined that they were fine, but the gambler's anger came from a personal losing streak, not manipulation. Instead of challenging him, Vincent spoke in a gentle tone, offering reassurance and suggesting a short break with complimentary drinks. His calm voice dissolved the tension like water smoothing hot stone. The gambler agreed reluctantly, and the crisis vanished as quickly as it appeared. What Vincent didn't realize was that someone else had been watching, a quiet observer seated in the shadows of the back bar. Someone who recognized the rare value of a young man who could control the room without raising his voice. Someone who would soon pull Vincent into a world far deeper than casino floors. And so, with each shift, each observation, each subtle decision, Vincent was unknowingly walking toward the destiny that waited patiently in the neon glow, toward becoming the man Glitter Town would one day call the Dice King. Vincent's reputation grew quietly, as all true power does, like an undercurrent beneath the loud, sparkling surface of Glitter Town. His rise wasn't marked by bombastic declarations or headlines. Instead, it was built slowly, brick by brick, through quiet interventions and subtle influences. The more he observed, the more he realized that his unique gift wasn't just the ability to read the tables or anticipate the unexpected. It was his understanding of people, their fears, their desires, their weaknesses, and how to use that knowledge to restore balance before chaos could erupt. The city, with its shifting sands of ambition and greed, often attracted men and women who believed they could outplay the system. Gamblers tried to outwit the odds, businessmen tried to outmaneuver the law, and even the casino bosses tried to outsmart each other. But what they all overlooked was that the true game wasn't played on the casino floor. The game was in the unseen interactions that could topple an empire before it even began, in the whispered conversations between executives, the silent agreements made in dark corners, and the quiet betrayals that no one ever saw coming. In the early days of his work, Vincent had kept to his role as a humble fixer, always staying in the background. But as his confidence grew, so did his circle of influence. One night, while walking the floors after a long shift, he was approached by a man he had only heard of in passing, Tommy, the butcher, Romano. A heavy-set man with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from stone, Tommy was known for his connections to the local syndicate and his ability to broker deals that everyone else was too scared to touch. Vincent had only heard rumors about him, stories of him coming into a room and making people sweat with just a single glance. Yet when Tommy approached him that night, there was no intimidation in his manner, just a curiosity that felt like a challenge. "You're Vincent, right?" Tommy asked, his voice low but with a warmth that didn't match the weight of his reputation. "I hear you're good with problems. A real problem solver." Vincent didn't respond immediately. He studied Tommy's face, searching for signs of trickery or deceit, as he always did. "I try my best," he said simply, his tone neutral. Tommy chuckled, a deep sound that didn't quite match his imposing frame. "I like that. I need someone who can handle delicate situations. Someone who doesn't panic at the first sign of trouble. You ever think about working with me?" The offer was vague, but Vincent understood what Tommy was implying. This wasn't a job for a bellhop or a casual errand runner. This was an invitation into the web of power that held Glitter Town together, and in many ways, kept it from falling apart. Vincent knew that saying yes would pull him into a world far more dangerous than the one he had known, but he also understood that it was an opportunity he couldn't afford to pass up. So, after a long pause, he gave a simple nod. From that moment on, Vincent's role expanded beyond the confines of the casino. He was no longer just a quiet observer of the floor, he was now a part of the system, a discreet participant in the delicate dance of organized crime and legitimate business that formed the backbone of Glitter Town's economy. His first assignments were small, a quiet word with a casino owner whose debts were starting to pile up, a chat with a supplier whose product wasn't being delivered on time, a whispered suggestion to a hotel manager who was dealing with an unruly guest. Each task felt trivial, but each one was a test. A test of his ability to navigate a world where information was currency and trust was bought with the price of silence. As Vincent's reputation grew, so did the complexity of the problems that came to him. The stakes were higher now, no longer were they just minor inconveniences or disputes over gambling winnings, but serious issues that could affect the balance of power in the city. One night, a casino owner who had recently expanded his operations into the high-stakes poker scene found himself in a bind. A high-profile gambler, one who was rumored to have connections to an unsavory crime family, had been losing large sums of money. But instead of accepting his losses, the gambler started making threats to expose the casino's ties to the underworld unless his debts were erased. Vincent was called in to mediate. The owner, sweating beneath the glitzy veneer of his empire, was nervous, knowing that the gambler's connections could reach far beyond the reach of any law enforcement. He needed the problem resolved discreetly, before the gambler's threats escalated. When Vincent met with the gambler, he did not approach the situation with the brashness of someone in charge. Instead, he allowed the gambler to speak first, to vent his anger and frustrations. As the man ranted about unfair odds, lost fortunes, and his growing need for revenge, Vincent listened. But he didn't just hear the words, he listened to the spaces between them, the tremor in the gambler's voice, the signs of desperation hidden beneath the bravado. At the right moment, Vincent spoke, his voice soft but firm. "You're not angry about the game," he said, his words cutting through the gambler's fury like a knife through silk. "You're angry because you've lost control. The house always wins, but that's not your problem." Your problem is that you can't control the game anymore. And that's why you're scared. The gambler stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as if Vincent had pulled the lid off a hidden wound. For a long moment, there was only silence. Finally, the gambler spoke again, but this time his voice was quieter, almost defeated. "Can you fix this?" he asked. Vincent nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the gambler's face. "I can," he said simply. "But only if you agree to play by the rules. No more threats, no more games. Just an honest settlement." By the end of their conversation, the gambler agreed to pay off his debts under a new, more manageable arrangement. No violence was needed. No threats. Just a quiet resolution. Vincent had learned that in Glitter Town, problems could be solved as much by the art of conversation as by any amount of force or intimidation. But even as his reputation solidified, Vincent knew that every decision came with consequences. The more power he accrued, the more people took notice, and the more enemies he unknowingly made. There were whispers about his influence, about the quiet man who seemed to hold all the cards without ever showing his hand. And as the city continued to grow, so too did the complexity of its undercurrents. Behind every successful deal, every smooth negotiation, lay the question of how long it could last. Would Vincent be able to maintain the delicate balance he had created, or would the web of power in Glitter Town eventually tighten too much, trapping even him in its tangled threads? The answer, of course, was something only time could reveal. But for now, Vincent's quiet rise seemed unstoppable. Vincent's life in Glitter Town had settled into a rhythm, one that blurred the line between business and power. The nights were filled with neon lights and clinking glasses, while the days passed in quieter moments of observation and strategic thought. He had learned early that in this city, nothing was truly what it appeared to be. Behind every flashy casino, every luxurious hotel, and every carefully constructed smile, there were deals being made, some legitimate, others far less so. The undercurrents of corruption, ambition, and survival ran deep, and Vincent, now a trusted figure in the tangled web of Glitter Town's power structure, had grown adept at navigating them. Yet with power came not just privilege, but responsibility. And as his influence expanded, so did the complexity of the situations that crossed his path. One of the first lessons he learned was that in a world governed by money and fear, loyalty was the rarest and most valuable currency. People in Glitter Town didn't always play by the rules, and Vincent began to realize that alliances could be as fleeting as the neon lights that illuminated the strip. What was valuable one night could be discarded the next. The game he had entered was one that required constant vigilance, a steady hand, and the ability to make decisions that were sometimes ruthless, but always calculated. It wasn't long before Vincent found himself facing a challenge that would test him in ways he had not yet experienced. The casino floor, for all its flash and glamour, was not the only arena where power played out. In the shadows, away from the flashing lights of the gaming tables and the buzz of slot machines, there were the syndicates, the men who controlled the money flowing through Glitter Town's veins, those who dealt with things that the public couldn't see or wouldn't understand. These men were the true power brokers, the ones who made the deals that kept everything running smoothly, or as smoothly as possible in a world built on chaos. It was during one of these late-night meetings that Vincent found himself face-to-face with one of the most influential figures in the city, a man named Frank, the Fixer, Di Pietro. Frank was a man who had his hands in nearly every corner of the Glitter Town underworld, from protection rackets to shady land deals, and his influence extended far beyond the reaches of the Strip. It was said that Frank could make or break anyone in the city with the stroke of a pen or the whisper of a word. Yet, despite his power, Frank was a man of few words. He was known for his cold, calculating demeanor, and for getting things done without fanfare. He didn't need to shout to be heard. People listened because they had no choice. Vincent had heard stories about Frank, about his ruthless efficiency and his ability to make problems disappear without leaving a trace. But meeting him in person was something entirely different. Frank was a man who did not waste time on pleasantries. When Vincent walked into the room where they were to meet, Frank was already sitting at the table, his dark eyes locked on Vincent with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "I've heard things about you," Frank said, his voice smooth and unhurried, but with an edge that hinted at something more dangerous beneath. "They say you're good at solving problems. That you know how to handle situations that others can't." Vincent said nothing at first, allowing Frank to continue. It was always better to listen than to speak too soon. "I've got a problem," Frank continued, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the surface of the table. "And I think you're the man who can fix it." Vincent's mind immediately began to race. A problem. A problem with Frank DiPietro. He knew better than to ask questions before receiving all the details. But he also knew that no problem, no matter how simple, ever came without strings attached in this world. He waited, patient, his expression neutral. Frank leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "There's a new player in town. A guy named Vito Ruggiero. He's been moving in on some of my territory, making things difficult for my people. I need him dealt with. Quietly. But it can't look like it was me or anyone from my crew. I need plausible deniability. And I need it done fast. Can you handle that?" The request was simple enough on the surface, but Vincent knew better than to take it at face value. Frank was asking for something that would require more than just a physical solution. He was asking for a ghost, a problem to be erased without a trace, something that would leave no suspicion behind. It was the kind of work that could make or break a man in this line of business. And it would also test Vincent's loyalty to those who had become his allies in Glitter Town. As the weight of the request settled in, Vincent's mind began to work through the possibilities. He had no intention of carrying out a hit, not directly, anyway. He didn't need to. His skills lay in the subtleties, finding ways to make people disappear without bloodshed, without the need for violence. There were ways to erase someone from the equation without ever having to raise a hand. And Vincent knew that his expertise in negotiation, manipulation, and quiet pressure was more powerful than a gunshot. "I can handle it," Vincent finally said, his voice calm, controlled. "But it'll take time. And it'll take precision. We don't want anyone to connect this to you." Frank studied him for a long moment, and in that silence, Vincent could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air. It was a test, he knew, one that would either cement his place among the city's elite or mark the beginning of his fall. "Good," Frank finally said, his voice as cold as ever. "I'll leave it in your hands. But remember, failure's not an option." With that, Frank stood, offering no handshake, no further words of encouragement. It was a simple transaction, a deal made, a problem assigned, a future shaped by the choices Vincent would now have to make. In the days that followed, Vincent began his work. He met with people who knew Vito, spoke to the right individuals who could provide him with the information he needed. Slowly, quietly, he learned about Vito's operations, how he had been using his charm to infiltrate local businesses, making promises he couldn't keep, using threats to get what he wanted. Vito was a man driven by ambition, but he lacked the subtlety that Vincent had honed over the years. His brash tactics had already started to make enemies, and that, Vincent realized, was his leverage. Rather than resorting to violence, Vincent took a different route. He exploited Vito's weaknesses, his overconfidence, his need for approval, and his underestimation of the forces working against him. Within weeks, Vincent had turned Vito's allies into his enemies, creating a web of suspicion and distrust that slowly unraveled everything Vito had built. By the time Vito realized what had happened, he had no support left, no allies to turn to. And without a single shot being fired, Vincent had solved Frank's problem, quietly, discreetly, and without ever drawing attention to himself. It was a victory, but not one that Vincent celebrated. In this world, there was no room for celebration. There was only the next problem, the next challenge, the next deal. And with each success, Vincent knew that the shadows of Glitter Town were growing longer, and the game he had entered was becoming more dangerous by the day. The deeper Vincent sank into the intricate machinery of Glitter Town, the more he realized that the city's charm wasn't just in its bright lights or its glittering facade, it was in the complex web of relationships that held it all together. In many ways, the city was like a grand casino, everything was a bet, everything a calculated risk. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the house didn't just win, it devoured you whole. He'd learned that lesson quickly, but with each success, he grew more certain of the path he was carving for himself. A path that, while full of opportunities, was fraught with dangers that even he had yet to fully comprehend. At the heart of Glitter Town's chaos, Vincent understood, were the men who held the power to create or destroy with a flick of their wrist. They were the mobsters, the casino magnates, the crooked politicians. The men who made sure the money flowed and that their influence stretched far beyond the city limits. These were the real players, the ones who knew that life in Glitter Town was a game of perception. Keep your enemies close, your allies closer, and make sure no one ever knew which side you were really on. It was at this crossroads that Vincent found himself face to face with yet another powerful figure in the city, Salvatore, Sal the Shark, Mancini. A man with a reputation that stretched across the western United States, Sal was a casino magnate with ties to nearly every major syndicate in the country. His influence extended far beyond the gambling tables. He was rumored to be involved in everything from land acquisitions to high-stakes poker rings, and his fingers were deeply embedded in the city's political machinery. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a kingmaker, and his ability to make or break anyone in Glitter Town was unrivaled. Vincent had known about Sal for years, heard the whispers about his dealings, seen the luxurious mansions and private jets that followed him wherever he went, but until that moment, he had never crossed paths with him. The first time they met was at a private gathering, a small dinner party attended by the city's most influential figures. The table was set in an opulent room, with golden chandeliers casting a soft glow over the polished wood and crystal glasses. But despite the lavish setting, Vincent could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't a social gathering, it was a game of power, and every person at the table had a part to play. Sal was already seated when Vincent entered, a glass of scotch in his hand. He didn't rise to greet him, he didn't need to. Instead, he studied Vincent for a long moment, his dark eyes narrowing as though assessing the newcomer in front of him. For a man who had built his empire on manipulation and careful maneuvering, Sal had an uncanny ability to look right through you, to peel away the layers of pretense and see what was at your core. It was a skill that Vincent had come to recognize in himself, but seeing it in someone else was unnerving. "You're Vincent Caravetta," Sal said, his voice low and deliberate. "I've heard quite a bit about you." Vincent nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm sure you have." Sal smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You've made a name for yourself in this town, kid. Quietly, but effectively. That's rare around here. People like you, they don't stay quiet for long." There was something about the way Sal said those words that made Vincent's stomach tighten. Sal didn't just observe the world around him, he controlled it. And from that moment, Vincent understood that Sal had already sized him up. He knew exactly what Vincent was capable of, and he was waiting to see how he would play the game. For the next few hours, they talked about everything and nothing at all, business deals, city politics, the latest scandals that had rocked Glitter Town. But beneath the surface of casual conversation, Vincent could feel the undercurrent of something more serious. Sal wasn't just making small talk, he was testing him, seeing how far Vincent would go, how much he could reveal without giving away too much. And Vincent, ever cautious, played along, offering just enough to keep Sal interested but not enough to reveal his hand. As the night wore on, Sal grew more direct. "I've got a situation, Vincent. A little problem that needs a solution. Something that's, well, let's just say it's become a thorn in my side. And I think you might be the right person to take care of it." Vincent didn't ask questions. He had learned that it was better to listen, to gather information before responding. But he could feel the weight of the unspoken request hanging in the air. There were always problems in Glitter Town, and when someone like Sal Mancini called on you, it wasn't because they needed help with something simple. What kind of problem? Vincent finally asked, his voice steady but curious. Sal leaned back in his chair, swirling his scotch. I've got a business partner. He's been slipping. Losing his edge. And when that happens in this town, it's not just a personal issue, it becomes a business problem. A big one. If he's not careful, he could drag us both down. Vincent nodded slowly, recognizing the situation for what it was. A weak link. And in Glitter Town, weak links were the first to be removed. Sal's gaze fixed on him, sharp and unblinking. I need you to take care of it. Quietly. No mess, no noise. Just make sure this guy understands the consequences of his actions. I'm giving you the opportunity to make your mark, Vincent. Don't make me regret it. In that moment, Vincent realized the full weight of what Sal was offering, and what he was asking. It wasn't just a business problem, it was a test. A chance to prove himself in the eyes of one of the most powerful men in Glitter Town. And while Vincent knew that aligning himself with Sal Mancini could open doors, it also came with risks. He would be walking a fine line between loyalty and self-preservation, between doing what was necessary and what was right. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Vincent set up meetings, gathered information, and began to plan the delicate steps that would resolve Sal's problem. His approach was always the same, methodical, calculated, and precise. He knew that the best way to solve a problem like this wasn't through force, but through manipulation, carefully applying pressure where it would hurt the most, without leaving a trace. He understood the psychology of fear better than most, and he knew how to make someone see their own downfall without ever needing to raise a hand. As he worked through the situation, he realized that his true skill wasn't just in fixing problems, it was in making sure that the people involved in those problems never truly understood how they had been outmaneuvered. It wasn't about the immediate solution, it was about the long-term effect. It was about making sure that once a problem was solved, it stayed solved. By the time Vincent delivered the solution to Sal, the problem had been erased without a single whisper of violence. The man who had been the source of Sal's concern was quietly eliminated from the equation, his reputation tarnished beyond repair, his business interests redirected to more controllable hands. Sal, as always, took credit for it, but Vincent knew that the real work had been done in the shadows, his shadows. And in that moment, Vincent knew he had made the right choice. He had proven his worth, but more importantly, he had earned Sal's trust. For better or for worse, he had become a permanent fixture in Glitter Town's web of power. As Vincent's influence deepened within Glitter Town, the very landscape of the city seemed to shift. It wasn't just about the dealings in backrooms anymore, nor was it confined to the smooth transactions that occurred under the neon glow of the strip. Vincent had reached a level where the stakes were higher, the game far more complex. He had become not just a fixer or a problem solver, he was now a critical player in the hidden world that controlled the heartbeat of Glitter Town. His name carried weight, but it also carried risk. The power dynamics in Glitter Town were constantly in flux. Alliances were formed and broken on a whim, as men with power were always jockeying for position. There was a delicate balance between controlling the casinos, manipulating the politicians, and keeping the criminal underworld in check. And Vincent, who had learned to move with subtlety, became acutely aware of the fact that one misstep could bring everything crashing down. People like him, those who thrived in the shadows, were always walking a thin line between respect and betrayal. It wasn't long before Vincent found himself on the receiving end of an invitation he couldn't ignore. One of the most influential figures in Glitter Town, a man whose name was synonymous with both wealth and secrecy, had requested a meeting. Angelo, the Ghost, Lombardi was a legend in his own right. The head of one of the largest crime syndicates in the country, Lombardi operated from the shadows, controlling everything from drug shipments to underground fight rings. He was a man who rarely showed his face and never made public appearances, but his presence loomed large over the city. No one knew exactly how he did it, how he kept his empire so secret while pulling the strings of some of the most powerful people in the country, but what was clear was that no one dared to cross him. The invitation to meet him was, in itself, a statement. It was a rare honor, and it came with an unspoken warning: either you proved yourself worthy, or you would be discarded. For Vincent, who had always operated on the fringes, this meeting was a pivotal moment. It could elevate him to a new level of power, or it could mark the beginning of his downfall. The night of the meeting, Vincent found himself in a dimly lit, secluded room in one of the most discreet venues in Glitter Town. The walls were lined with antique bookshelves, the air thick with the scent of cigars and expensive whiskey. There was no glitz here, no flashing lights, just shadows and whispered conversations. Angelo Lombardi sat across from him, his steely eyes assessing every move Vincent made. Unlike the others in this world, Lombardi didn't play games with words. He wasn't interested in small talk. His voice was like the scrape of metal against stone. "You're the one who's been making waves around here," Lombardi said, his tone flat but with an undercurrent of something dangerous. "I've been watching you. You've got skills, no doubt about that. But the real question is, what do you want?" Vincent had prepared for this moment. He'd spent days thinking through every possible scenario, weighing his options. He knew better than to walk into a room like this without having a clear answer. But he also knew that the right answer could make all the difference. "I want control," Vincent said, his voice steady, betraying no hint of uncertainty. "I want a seat at the table. I'm tired of staying in the background. I can do more than solve problems. I can create opportunities. I can build something that lasts." Lombardi's eyes never wavered. He studied Vincent as though deciding whether to trust him, or perhaps deciding whether Vincent's ambition was his strength or his weakness. "You think you can build something lasting?" Lombardi asked, his voice still cold, but now tinged with curiosity. "This town doesn't play by those rules. It's a place built on greed, on fear, on betrayal. You can't build anything that lasts here unless you understand that nothing stays in place for long. Not power, not people. Not even the city itself." Vincent knew Lombardi was testing him, pushing him to see how much he understood about the nature of power in Glitter Town. Lombardi wasn't interested in idealists or dreamers. He wanted people who knew the harsh truth about how the world worked. And Vincent did. He had learned quickly that in a place like this, control was fleeting. Nothing was permanent. Not the alliances you built, not the deals you brokered. Everything could be taken away in the blink of an eye. "I understand," Vincent replied, his tone measured. "But I believe I can make something endure, even in a place like this. Not everything has to crumble." Lombardi leaned back, taking a slow sip of his drink. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment, Vincent wasn't sure if the conversation was over or if he had just made the greatest mistake of his life. But then Lombardi spoke again, his voice softer, though still heavy with authority. "You've got guts," Lombardi said, his gaze never leaving Vincent's. "I can respect that. But let me tell you something, control in Glitter Town isn't about being smart. It's about being ruthless. It's about knowing when to push, when to pull back, and when to make a move that no one expects. It's about understanding the people around you, the ones who are loyal and the ones who are waiting for you to slip up. And most of all, it's about knowing how to stay one step ahead of everyone else, even when it looks like you're in checkmate." Vincent nodded, absorbing Lombardi's words. He had always understood that survival in Glitter Town required more than just intelligence or charisma. It required a certain ruthlessness, a willingness to do what others wouldn't, to make the tough calls when everyone else hesitated. But Lombardi was right, being ruthless wasn't enough. You had to understand the game from every angle, to know when to play and when to retreat. And Vincent was beginning to realize that to truly control Glitter Town, he would need to become something more than just a problem solver. He would need to be a master of strategy, a player who could bend the rules without breaking them. As the meeting continued, Lombardi made his expectations clear. He wasn't offering Vincent a partnership, at least, not yet. What he was offering was a test. A chance to prove himself. "There's a job I need done," Lombardi said, his voice cold once again. "A delicate matter. Something that requires a certain touch. Do it right, and I'll consider you a real player in this town. Fail, and you'll be nothing more than a footnote in a story no one remembers." Vincent knew that this was it, the moment that would define his future in Glitter Town. He had already made a name for himself, but this was different. This wasn't just a problem to fix. This was a chance to cement his place at the table, to show that he was more than just a shadow in the background. "I'll handle it," Vincent said, his voice unwavering. "And it'll be done right." Lombardi's eyes flickered with something akin to approval, though he showed no outward emotion. "Good. Let's see what you're really made of, then." As Vincent left Lombardi's presence, the weight of the task ahead settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew that his future in Glitter Town now hung in the balance. The stakes had been raised, and the real game was just beginning. This was no longer about fixing small problems or working in the shadows. This was about control. And Vincent was ready to fight for it, even if it meant doing things he had never done before. Because in Glitter Town, only one thing was certain: in the end, the city would swallow you whole if you didn't learn how to play its game. And Vincent Caravetta wasn't about to let that happen. Vincent's task for Lombardi was one that had both the promise of great reward and the looming threat of catastrophic failure. It was delicate, complex, and not the kind of job a man like Vincent could afford to botch. Lombardi, despite his rare moments of encouragement, had left little room for error. His cold warning had rung in Vincent's ears long after the meeting ended: "Do it right, or you won't be around long enough to regret it." The job was straightforward in concept but dangerous in execution. It involved one of Lombardi's most valuable but unstable allies, a man named Dom Cavallo. Cavallo was a high-ranking figure in the syndicate who controlled a significant portion of the city's illicit activities: gambling, drugs, rackets, and even a network of corrupt officials who answered to his every command. But Cavallo had a weakness. Over the past few months, his grip on power had begun to slip. He had developed an unhealthy dependence on drugs, his temper had become erratic, and his decision-making, once sharp and ruthless, had started to show signs of weakness. The cracks were small, but they were there. And in the world of organized crime, any weakness was a fatal one. Lombardi had entrusted Vincent with a task that was simple on the surface: remove Cavallo from the picture. Quietly, cleanly, and without causing any suspicion. This wasn't about violence, at least, not yet. It was about cutting ties with a man who had become a liability, and doing so in a way that wouldn't draw attention from the wrong people. It was a task that would require finesse, subtlety, and, above all, discretion. But Vincent knew that any misstep would lead to an unpredictable outcome. Cavallo was not just a business partner, he was also a confidant of some of the city's most influential figures. His fall could trigger a cascade of reactions, each more dangerous than the last. For the next several days, Vincent immersed himself in planning. He spent countless hours talking to people who worked with Cavallo, his associates, underlings, anyone who might have insight into the man's routine, his weaknesses, his blind spots. He learned everything he could about Cavallo's habits, where he spent his time, who he trusted, what his vulnerabilities were. As Vincent delved deeper into Cavallo's life, he began to understand the scope of the task ahead of him. Cavallo was surrounded by loyalists, men who would go to any lengths to protect him. Getting to him wouldn't be easy. But it had to be done. The first move was to isolate Cavallo. Vincent knew that to remove him without suspicion, he had to create a scenario where Cavallo was alone, vulnerable, and without his usual network of protection. This meant finding a way to sever his connections, one by one. Vincent began spreading rumors about Cavallo's instability, whispering to the right people at the right time. He spoke to a few of Cavallo's closest allies, subtly suggesting that perhaps the man was no longer in full control of his operations. The plan was simple: make Cavallo seem unreliable, someone who could no longer be trusted with the responsibilities that had once been his. This would plant the seed of doubt among his supporters and set the stage for his downfall. But as Vincent worked his strategy, he began to realize just how precarious his own position had become. Cavallo's men were watching him, too, although they were more subtle about it. They didn't trust Vincent, none of them did. He was an outsider to them, someone who had come into the picture only recently. They saw him as an interloper, a rising star in Glitter Town, but one who had yet to prove his loyalty. This suspicion was something Vincent could not ignore. One slip-up, one wrong move, and the very people he had worked so hard to manipulate could turn on him. He could already feel the weight of their gaze, and he knew it was only a matter of time before someone decided to test his loyalty. But Vincent was no stranger to danger, and he didn't let this tension faze him. He knew how to handle pressure, how to move through a city like Glitter Town without giving away his intentions. He was always a step ahead of those who watched him, always looking for ways to deflect suspicion. And when the time came, he knew exactly what to do. The moment of reckoning arrived sooner than he had anticipated. Cavallo, ever paranoid about the whispers around him, began to isolate himself further from his allies. He started showing signs of desperation, getting high in public, making reckless decisions, and most dangerously, doubting the loyalty of the very people he had once trusted. It didn't take long for word to spread that Cavallo was losing his grip. The fractures that had once been small began to grow wider, and with them, the opportunity to make a decisive move. Vincent decided it was time to strike. He arranged a meeting with Cavallo at one of the more secluded, nondescript bars in Glitter Town. It was a place where the two could talk away from prying eyes, away from the noise and distractions of the casino floors. A place where Vincent could carry out his plan without drawing attention. The bar was dimly lit, with only a few patrons scattered around in the far corners, nursing their drinks. It was the perfect setting for what needed to happen next. As they sat down at a corner booth, Vincent offered Cavallo a drink, his calm demeanor in sharp contrast to the tension in the air. Cavallo, visibly on edge, didn't say much at first. His eyes darted around the room, as if expecting someone to jump out at him. But Vincent remained composed, his voice low and steady. "You're making things difficult for yourself, Dom," Vincent said, breaking the silence. "You don't have to do this the hard way." Cavallo shot him a sharp look, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and fear. "What do you mean, the hard way?" he asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "You're a man of power," Vincent replied, his voice soothing. "But you're losing it. People are starting to notice. The more you push, the more cracks show. You're on the edge, Dom. And I don't want to see you fall." For a moment, there was a long pause. Cavallo's eyes narrowed, and his grip on the glass tightened. He was trying to decide whether Vincent was offering him help or issuing a threat. But Vincent wasn't offering help, he was just showing him the inevitable truth. "I've been loyal to this city," Cavallo muttered. "I've worked hard. No one appreciates what I've done." Vincent leaned in, his eyes locking with Cavallo's. "That's the problem, Dom. You're holding on too tight. You've forgotten how to let go." Before Cavallo could respond, Vincent made his move. With a casual shift, he placed a small vial of powder on the table, a substance known only to a few in the city but feared by all. It was a drug that, if ingested in the right way, could induce a fatal overdose, leaving behind little trace. "Your time's up, Dom," Vincent whispered, as Cavallo's eyes widened in realization. The panic set in just a moment too late. As Cavallo's world began to crumble around him, Vincent knew that the first piece had fallen into place. Cavallo, a man who had once seemed untouchable, was now a cautionary tale. And Vincent had managed to take him down with nothing more than a quiet whisper and the flick of a finger. But the price of power, as Vincent had learned, was always high. And he was only just beginning to see how much he would have to pay for his place at the top. Vincent's maneuver with Dominic Cavallo had been executed with precision, but the fallout was far from over. In the world he inhabited, power was fragile, and the ripple effect of one action could shift the entire balance of the underworld. Cavallo's sudden and mysterious disappearance sent shockwaves through Glitter Town, though no one yet knew the full story. Word had spread quickly, and Vincent found himself walking a thin line between rising in power and becoming a target. Those who had once seen him as an up-and-coming figure now looked at him with a mix of admiration and suspicion. The first signs of trouble appeared in the form of subtle shifts in behavior among his allies. People who had once been loyal started acting differently, more cautious. There were whispered conversations when Vincent walked into a room, and eyes that lingered a little too long when he passed by. The trust he had painstakingly built was starting to erode, and he could feel the tension creeping in. There was no outright confrontation, at least, not yet, but it was clear that Vincent was no longer seen as someone who had just arrived on the scene. He was now a threat. The question was whether he had the resources and the resolve to hold his ground. In the days following Cavallo's disappearance, Vincent kept his ear to the ground, gathering information from every corner of the city. He wasn't sure who had started the rumors, but he knew that the underworld worked quickly. Everyone seemed to be asking the same question: what happened to Cavallo? The official story was that he'd gone into hiding, perhaps on the run from enemies, but Vincent knew better. People in the streets, in the bars, and in the back rooms of the casinos weren't buying that story. They could smell the fear in the air, the unspoken truth that something far more sinister had taken place. As the days turned into weeks, Vincent's anxiety only grew. He had eliminated Cavallo, but in doing so, he had inadvertently opened a Pandora's box of uncertainties. There were other factions in Glitter Town, factions that were still loyal to Cavallo, or at least loyal to the power he once represented. Some of them were now looking for answers, trying to piece together the truth behind his disappearance. And some of them were beginning to ask themselves whether Vincent had been the one to orchestrate it. Vincent knew that the silence couldn't last forever. There were only so many whispered rumors and half-suspicions that could remain unaddressed. Sooner or later, someone would want to confront him directly, someone who had the means to make him pay for what he had done. It was during one of these tense weeks that Vincent received a visit from an old acquaintance, one who had been a part of his life in the earlier years but had since drifted away. Salvatore Sal Gallo was a well-connected man, known in the criminal world for his sharp mind and his ability to broker deals that benefited everyone, at least, on the surface. In reality, Gallo was more of a manipulator, a man who knew how to play both sides of any situation. He was also a former associate of Cavallo's, someone who had worked closely with him in the past. Sal's appearance was not a coincidence. Vincent knew that Gallo's presence meant something was brewing, and it wasn't good. He hadn't come to visit Vincent for old time's sake. No, Sal was here because he knew something, or at least suspected something, about Cavallo's fate. The tension in the room was palpable as the two men sat across from each other in a quiet backroom of one of Glitter Town's most discreet establishments. "You're looking well," Sal said, his voice smooth but laced with an edge of suspicion. He was sizing Vincent up, as always, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Cut the pleasantries, Sal," Vincent replied. His patience was thin, and he didn't have time for games. "What do you want?" Sal leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "You know, I've been hearing some things," he began, his tone casual but heavy with meaning. "People have been talking, wondering what happened to Dom. And I have to admit, I've been doing some wondering myself." Vincent felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew this was the beginning of a very dangerous conversation. "What are you getting at?" he asked, his voice low. Sal smiled slightly, though there was no warmth in it. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Vin," he said. "But you have to admit, Cavallo's disappearance is a little too convenient, don't you think?" Vincent's eyes narrowed. He had expected this. He had known that someone like Sal would catch wind of the situation eventually. The question was whether he could deflect suspicion long enough to ensure his own survival. "People like to talk," Vincent said, maintaining his composure. Cavallo was a liability, and sometimes people disappear. Doesn't mean I'm involved. Sal's eyes gleamed. People do disappear, but not like that. Not when they're so well protected. You're telling me you had nothing to do with it? Vincent didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Sal. I didn't do anything you wouldn't have done yourself, he said, his voice steady, but with a trace of steel beneath the calm exterior. Cavallo was a liability. He was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before he made the rest of us look bad. It had to be done. But if you're implying that Sal held up a hand to stop him. I'm not saying a word, Vin. Not yet, anyway. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. But I do think it's worth mentioning that there are others who might not see things the same way. Others who were closer to Cavallo. They're asking questions, too. And those questions might lead to you. Vincent felt his heart rate spike, though his expression remained unchanged. He knew exactly what Sal was implying. There were factions in the city, people loyal to Cavallo, that would now be looking for answers. And if they found Vincent at the center of this, it could mean war. Not just against him, but against everything he had built. Sal leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The question now is whether you're prepared for what happens next. You've made your move, but others are making theirs too. You need to decide if you want to keep climbing, or if you want to fall with the rest of them. Vincent didn't respond immediately. The weight of Sal's words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Vincent felt the true cost of his ambition. The more he reached for power, the more fragile it became. But there was no going back. The pieces were in motion, and he had no choice but to keep playing the game. I'm ready, Vincent said at last, his voice quiet but resolute. I'm prepared for whatever comes next. Sal gave him a long look, as if gauging his sincerity. Then, with a slight nod, he stood up and left the room without another word, leaving Vincent alone with the heavy realization that the true battle was only just beginning. The road ahead would be treacherous, and Vincent's every move would be scrutinized. He was no longer just a fixer or a rising star. He was a target, and in Glitter Town, targets never stayed in one place for long. Vincent's world had shifted once more. The meeting with Salvatore Gallo had left a lingering sense of foreboding, a shadow that seemed to stretch longer with every passing day. The city had always been a place where alliances were fragile, where loyalty could crumble in an instant, and betrayal was often just a whisper away. But now, Vincent could feel it, a tightening noose. Every action, every decision, had begun to matter more. No longer could he move like he once had, confidently, assuming that his rise would be uninterrupted. Since Cavallo's disappearance, the whispers had turned into open rumors. The power vacuum left in the wake of the old man's fall had begun to attract vultures. It wasn't just Gallo who had taken notice. There were others, hungry for control, eager to fill the void that had been left by the former mafia boss. Some of these men were longtime members of the syndicate, others were newcomers who had no allegiance to anyone but themselves. To them, Vincent was not a figure of respect, but a threat. They viewed him as someone who had played the game too well, too quickly, and that meant he was ripe for being knocked down. For the first time, Vincent found himself questioning whether the empire he had so carefully crafted could survive the scrutiny. The underworld was not kind to men who rose too fast. Those who got too comfortable at the top often found themselves with a target on their back. His nerves were kept in check by his determination, but even he couldn't ignore the mounting pressure that was starting to crack the surface of his composed facade. Late one evening, as Vincent sat in the small, dimly lit office he had claimed as his own, a knock at the door startled him. The sound was sharp and deliberate, an interruption to his thoughts that he hadn't been expecting. "Come in," he said, his voice low, almost without emotion. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was Frankie, one of his closest men, but the look on his face was far from the usual calm professionalism that Vincent had come to expect. There was something in his eyes, something urgent, and it immediately set off alarm bells in Vincent's mind. "Vin, we need to talk," Frankie said, his tone heavy with a sense of unease that Vincent couldn't ignore. Vincent gestured to the chair across from him, signaling for Frankie to sit. The atmosphere between them was thick with tension. "What's going on, Frankie?" Frankie hesitated, looking around as if to make sure no one else could hear. Then he spoke, his words blunt and straightforward. "There's a group of men. They're starting to move, Vin. They're talking about taking you down, starting with the businesses, and then, well, you know how it goes. You're a threat now, and they want to eliminate that threat." Vincent's jaw tightened. He'd known this was coming. The game had changed, and there were always men in the shadows, waiting for an opening, ready to make their move when they sensed weakness. "I figured as much," Vincent replied calmly, though inside, his mind was already racing. "Who are they? And how many? It's not just one group. It's a coalition, of sorts. Some of Cavallo's old men, some new blood, guys who want a bigger piece of the pie. They're not happy with the way things are shifting, and they're not buying the story about Cavallo running off. They know something happened. They're circling, waiting for an opportunity to strike." Vincent took a deep breath, steeling himself for what would come next. He had prepared for this moment, but there was still the gnawing feeling that he hadn't prepared enough. The streets of Glitter Town were always in motion, and someone, somewhere, was looking for a way to bring him down. He'd played the game long enough to know how it worked, the strongest always got knocked off first. "How many?" Vincent asked again, this time with a sharper edge to his voice. "Not sure exactly, but it's growing. Word is, there's a meeting scheduled for tomorrow night at one of the old docks. A neutral place, but it's a gathering of men who have the means to cause a lot of damage." Vincent's thoughts began to click into place. The dockyards were neutral ground in the underworld, a place where the rules of the syndicate still held, but where no single faction could claim ultimate control. It was the perfect place for a meeting like the one Frankie was describing. But it was also a dangerous place, full of untrustworthy faces. If this group was planning to make a move against him, it could be the beginning of a larger conflict. He couldn't afford to be blindsided. "Tomorrow night, huh?" Vincent muttered, more to himself than to Frankie. He leaned back in his chair, letting the information settle in his mind. The wheels were turning, and he was already calculating his options. "Get me details about the meeting. Everything. Who's going to be there, who's backing it, who's organizing it. I want to know everything." Frankie nodded, his expression grim. "I'll get on it. But Vin, we're running out of time. These guys aren't going to wait forever." "I know," Vincent said, his voice steady. "But I've got plans. Get me that information." As Frankie left the room, Vincent sat back, his mind racing. He knew that this was the defining moment. If he didn't act decisively, everything he had built, his influence, his businesses, his very life, could be torn down in an instant. There was no room for hesitation. He couldn't wait for others to make their moves. He had to take control. In the hours that followed, Vincent put his plan into motion. He started pulling in his most trusted men, those who had been with him since the beginning, men who had proven themselves loyal, men who understood how quickly things could fall apart. He spoke to each of them in turn, outlining the situation, getting their feedback, and preparing them for what was to come. The plan was simple, but it would take perfect execution. He would go to the meeting, but not as a supplicant or a victim. No, he would go as a leader, someone who commanded respect. He would walk in, head held high, and take control of the situation. He would use the confusion and uncertainty among his enemies to his advantage, turning their doubts into their downfall. Vincent was no longer the young man trying to rise in the world, he was the one they would all have to reckon with. And he intended to make them understand that they had made a fatal mistake by underestimating him. As night fell and the city settled into its usual rhythm of chaos, Vincent couldn't help but feel the weight of the choices he had made. He had come so far, built so much, but now he was standing on the precipice. There was no way to know what would happen next. Would he emerge victorious, his position in Glitter Town solidified? Or would this meeting be the start of his downfall? There was only one way to find out. He put on his coat, adjusted his collar, and headed for the docks. The game was on, and it was time for him to make his final move. The night was thick with tension as Vincent made his way to the docks. The fog had rolled in, a heavy, damp blanket that clung to the streets and wrapped itself around the dimly lit alleyways. It was the kind of night that felt like the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. His footsteps echoed on the wet pavement, the sound sharp and deliberate in the quiet of the early evening. The meeting at the docks was set for later, but Vincent had arrived early, as always. He preferred to take control of a situation before it had the chance to spiral beyond his grasp. He didn't like surprises, especially in this world. Every inch of his territory, every deal, every alliance, had to be calculated. The docks, with their quiet menace and long shadows, were the perfect place for a meeting like this, an open space where anything could happen. No one could be trusted here, not even the men who might consider themselves allies. In this environment, everyone had an agenda, and Vincent knew he had to be prepared for whatever was about to unfold. As he walked through the maze of crates and old warehouse buildings, the salty air from the harbor clung to his skin, mixing with the faint scent of oil and rust. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Frankie's warning had been clear: there were men gathering here tonight with the intention of taking him down. Some were likely old faces from Cavallo's crew, men who had been loyal to the old boss and resented Vincent's rise to power. Others, perhaps, were new players, outsiders looking to carve out a piece of Glitter Town for themselves. But Vincent had no intention of allowing that. This was his city now, and he would not let it slip through his fingers. He had made his plans, and he would stick to them. If these men wanted war, they would get it. But they had underestimated him if they thought he would walk into this meeting as a lamb to the slaughter. Vincent wasn't just a fixer anymore, he had become a force to be reckoned with. He checked his watch, just after midnight. He had arrived at the designated spot, a narrow alley between two large warehouses that looked abandoned in the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the sound of distant waves crashing against the docks, and the faint hum of machinery from the nearby shipping yards. He could feel the presence of others, though no one had yet stepped into view. The silence was almost oppressive. Vincent wasn't alone. A few of his most trusted men had arrived with him, stationed in strategic positions around the docks. He'd learned long ago that in this world, trust was earned but never given freely. So while he'd come alone, his men were watching from the shadows, ready to act at a moment's notice. There were no chances to take, no room for mistakes. He'd learned the hard way that hesitation could cost everything. And so, as the minutes passed, Vincent stood there, his posture relaxed but alert, his mind constantly calculating. He knew these men would try to test him, to push him, to see if they could provoke him into making a misstep. That was the way of the underworld. If they could make him show weakness, they'd have him. But Vincent had built himself to be unshakable. Years of navigating this life had taught him the value of patience, the importance of waiting for the right moment. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, Salvatore Gallo. The last man Vincent expected to see here, but the one who would make the most sense. Gallo was no stranger to power plays, and his involvement in this meeting only confirmed what Vincent had suspected all along: Sal had chosen a side. He wasn't the neutral player he had once appeared to be. Sal's eyes met Vincent's as he stepped forward, a wry smile crossing his face. Well, Vin. I didn't expect to see you here, he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. I thought you were smarter than that. Vincent didn't flinch. I could say the same to you, Sal. I didn't expect you to be part of this little gathering. He studied Sal, trying to gauge what had brought him here. The old man wasn't a fool, but he had a knack for knowing when to cut his losses. Was this a power grab, or was he just here to watch the chaos unfold? Sal chuckled darkly, glancing around at the men emerging from the shadows, all dressed in dark suits and carrying the unmistakable air of men who were used to wielding power. Vincent recognized a few of them, old-timers who had been around before Cavallo's fall, and some new faces who were hungry for a piece of the action. Sal had clearly brought them all together, and they had one thing in common: none of them were happy with the way things had been unfolding. "You think you're untouchable, don't you, Vincent?" Sal asked, his tone light but laced with something darker underneath. "You think that just because you've done a few jobs for the right people, you've earned your place at the table. But let me tell you something, you haven't. You're still a kid playing with fire." Vincent's gaze never left Sal's. "And you're still a man who's been sitting on the sidelines, watching the game pass him by. But I'm not here to talk about old grudges. I'm here to finish this." Sal's smile faded, and for a moment, Vincent could see the flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, or concern. "You're making a big mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with here." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Vincent said, his voice steady. "And the only mistake I'm making is giving you a chance to walk away. You and your boys have been sniffing around for far too long, thinking you can take what's mine. You can't." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Vincent thought that maybe Sal was going to back off. But then, without warning, the air around them seemed to crackle with tension. The other men had begun to move, closing in from all sides. They were making their move, and Vincent realized that the time for talking had passed. A man stepped forward from the shadows, one Vincent hadn't seen before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of look that said he had been in the business for far too long. His eyes were cold, calculating. He wasn't afraid of Vincent, and that made him dangerous. "We're not here to negotiate, Vincent," the man said, his voice deep and threatening. "You're a problem, and problems get dealt with." Vincent's pulse quickened, but his outward demeanor remained unchanged. He had expected this. He had prepared for it. His men were positioned, waiting for the signal. The game had already started, and Vincent was going to win. He didn't flinch. "You'll be making a mistake if you think you can take me down. This isn't about power, it's about respect. And I've earned mine." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. But Vincent knew that the moment they made a move, it would be his turn to strike. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a test. And Vincent was about to show them all that he wasn't just another player in the game. He was the one who made the rules now. The silence that followed Vincent's challenge seemed to stretch out indefinitely, hanging in the air like an unspoken threat. For a moment, it felt as though the entire world had come to a standstill. The fog around them seemed to thicken, as though it, too, was holding its breath. Vincent stood unmoving, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, scanning the faces of the men who had gathered in the shadows. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him, each one calculating, weighing their options, wondering if this would be the moment they decided to strike. The man who had stepped forward, a brute of a man with cold eyes, was the first to break the tension. He looked at Vincent with a sneer, clearly unimpressed by the younger man's defiance. "You're making a mistake, kid," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you've earned something here? You think just because you've done a few jobs you're above us? You don't know what real power looks like." Vincent didn't flinch. He had been in this position before, facing men who underestimated him, thinking they could intimidate him with words or size. He had learned long ago that power wasn't about muscle or threats, it was about control. And right now, Vincent controlled the situation. His men were in position, waiting for the signal, their eyes trained on the others, ready to move if necessary. But Vincent knew it wasn't time yet. He would wait until the moment was right. "I know exactly what power looks like," Vincent replied, his voice calm and measured. "And I know who holds it in this city. It's not you. It's me." The brute's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might charge. But then, something shifted. The other men, who had been standing in a loose circle around Vincent, began to exchange glances. They were uncertain, hesitant. They had come here thinking they would walk away with the upper hand, that they would be able to topple Vincent with a few well-placed moves. But something about his demeanor, his unwavering confidence, had made them pause. Salvatore Gallo, who had been standing off to the side, watching the exchange with a quiet intensity, stepped forward now. His face was unreadable, but there was something calculating in his eyes, as though he were trying to figure out his next move. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying authority. "This isn't the time or place for this." The brute looked at Sal, his expression darkening, but he said nothing. Instead, he took a step back, nodding to the other men who seemed to be waiting for some kind of signal. The tension in the air didn't dissipate, but the immediate threat of violence had been momentarily tempered. Vincent's eyes remained locked on Sal, knowing that this was the critical moment. Sal had the power to either let the situation escalate or bring it to a close. And Vincent needed him to make the right call. Sal turned his attention back to Vincent, his gaze piercing. "You're not as smart as you think you are, Vincent," he said, his tone quieter now, almost conversational. "You've made a lot of moves, built yourself a reputation, but you've also made enemies. And those enemies are not going to sit back and let you run things without a fight." Vincent stood tall, unfazed. "I'm not here for a fight. I'm here to take control. If you think you can take that from me, then make your move. But don't think for a second that I'll just step aside." Sal didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked over at the other men, as though weighing their thoughts. The brute who had spoken earlier gave a small grunt, clearly frustrated by the lack of immediate action. But Sal's steady gaze silenced any protest. Vincent could feel the shift in the air, the moment when everything would either unravel or settle into place. "I'm not here to start a war, Vincent," Sal said after a long pause, his voice low and deliberate. "But I'm also not going to let you think you can just walk in here and claim what's mine. This city doesn't belong to anyone. You're not above the game. You're just another player, and one misstep could be your last." Vincent's lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. He could sense the shift in Sal's attitude. There was still a sense of challenge in the older man's words, but there was also something else, a grudging respect, maybe, or at least an acknowledgement that Vincent was no longer the upstart he had once been. That, in itself, was a victory. "I never said I was above the game," Vincent replied, his voice steady. "But I've learned how to play it better than anyone else. And if you're smart, you'll recognize that. The only reason we're standing here, having this conversation, is because I've earned my place. The others," he gestured to the men standing behind Sal, "they've never done what I've done. They've never risked what I've risked. I'm not asking for respect. I'm demanding it." For the first time since the meeting had begun, there was a flicker of something in Sal's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or maybe something darker. But whatever it was gone in an instant, replaced by a mask of indifference. "I'll give you one chance, Vincent," Sal said, his voice cold. "Walk away from this. Leave Glitter Town, leave the power struggle, and we'll let you go. You'll live. But if you stay, if you continue this little game you're playing, you'll lose." Vincent's heart raced, but his face remained calm, even as his thoughts spun with the possibilities. Sal's offer was tempting, a way out without a fight, but Vincent knew it wasn't just about Glitter Town anymore. It was about everything he had worked for. He had clawed his way to this point, and there was no turning back. If he walked away now, he would never be taken seriously again. He would be just another has-been, another name lost in the underworld's endless cycle of rise and fall. "No deal," Vincent said, his voice unwavering. "I didn't come this far to turn my back now." Sal looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to push further. Then he sighed, almost wistfully. "It's a shame," he said quietly. "I liked you, Vincent. But you're not going to make it." Vincent didn't respond. Instead, he simply stood there, feeling the weight of the decision settle in his chest. This was it. The point of no return. He had chosen his path, and now, there was no way out but through. He could see the men around him tensing, waiting for the signal to move. The game was set. All that was left was for someone to make the first move. Vincent was ready. The time for words had passed. Now, only action would speak. And Vincent would make sure his actions were loud enough to silence any doubt about who controlled Glitter Town. The atmosphere around them thickened with a palpable tension, as if the very air in Glitter Town had come to a standstill, holding its breath. Every step, every glance, every movement seemed magnified in the quiet that followed Vincent's refusal. It was no longer about negotiation, it was about survival. The standoff had reached its breaking point, and Vincent could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him, heavy like a storm ready to break. The men around him began to shift, their movements subtle but telling. It was clear now that Salvatore Gallo had pushed as far as he could without making a move himself. The old man had given him the warning, offered the deal. Vincent had rejected it. There was no going back now. Sal, despite his years of experience, seemed to recognize that Vincent had become something else in the last few years. Something unyielding, and unafraid. The tension broke when the first gunshot rang out, echoing through the empty docks like thunder. It was followed by another, a closer sound this time, a sharp crack of noise that sent Vincent's instincts into overdrive. Without missing a beat, he dropped to the ground, instincts kicking in, his body a blur of motion. The others weren't as quick. The brute, who had been standing closest to Vincent, staggered back, a red stain blossoming across his chest. The rest of the men around them scrambled for cover, shouting in confusion and fear, unsure where the attack had come from. In the chaos, Vincent didn't hesitate. His mind raced, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge as he looked for his own weapon, his trusted sidearm. He found it beneath his jacket and pulled it free, his hands steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Get down!" Vincent shouted to his men, his voice cutting through the confusion. He didn't need to look to know that they were moving into position, spreading out across the docks, ready to return fire. But there was no clear target. The gunfire had come from the shadows, from a distance, and now, silence enveloped the scene once more, broken only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the docks. In the confusion, Salvatore Gallo had disappeared into the shadows, his figure swallowed up by the darkness. Vincent's eyes darted around the area, looking for any sign of movement. He could hear the low murmurs of his own men, the quiet crackling of radios as they checked in, trying to get a sense of what had just transpired. But Vincent didn't want to wait for an answer, he had to act. He knew Sal would not stand idly by after this. The old man was too dangerous, too smart to not use this as a point of leverage, and Vincent was certain this was only the beginning. Vincent turned to one of his men, a trusted associate named Marco. "Take the west end of the docks. Keep your eyes peeled. Whoever fired those shots is still out there," he said, his voice low but firm. Marco nodded and slipped into the darkness, moving swiftly, the sound of his footsteps fading into the night. Vincent didn't wait for a report. He couldn't afford to. His mind was already working, calculating the next steps, the next move. Who would make the first play? Who was behind this? And most importantly, where was Sal? "Get your gear together," Vincent said to the others, his eyes scanning the area, all senses alert. "We move out in 5 minutes. We're going to hunt down the son of a bitch who's trying to take us out." The docks, usually so silent and tranquil, had transformed into a battlefield. The air was thick with the scent of saltwater, metal, and blood, and Vincent could feel the weight of the moment settling over him like a cloak. He had made it this far by staying one step ahead of everyone, by knowing when to act, when to retreat, when to negotiate, and when to show his power. But now, the rules had changed. The game had escalated. Whoever had fired the shots wasn't just targeting him, this was about something bigger, something darker. Vincent's thoughts raced. Was this a power move by Salvatore Gallo, an attempt to intimidate him further? Or had it been someone else entirely? There were always other players in the shadows of Glitter Town. Ambitious men, waiting for their moment, hoping to take a piece of the action. But even as Vincent questioned the possibility of betrayal, one thing remained clear: this attack, this ambush, wasn't just a random act of violence. Someone had made a decision. Someone had chosen to take action. And Vincent wasn't going to let them get away with it. Any movement? Vincent asked, turning to the man who had been monitoring the radios. The reply came quickly, his face grim. Nothing yet. We're getting reports from all over the area. Some of the guys saw movement near the East Warehouse. No shots fired, though. Vincent's eyes narrowed. The East Warehouse was a perfect place to lay low, to hide, to regroup. He knew that if anyone was going to make a move against him, it would be there, in the shadows of the large, empty building, where no one could see what happened until it was too late. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the moment pressing in on him. We head to the East Warehouse. Move quickly, stay low, and keep your heads down. We don't know who's watching, and we don't know what they're planning, Vincent ordered, his voice steady despite the rising tension. His men didn't hesitate. They were already moving, slipping into the darkness, their weapons drawn, ready to follow his lead. As they moved towards the warehouse, Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. There was something about this attack that didn't sit right with him. The timing, the location, the way it had all unfolded, it all felt too coordinated, too precise. Whoever was behind this had planned it carefully. But why? What was the true motive behind the attack? By the time they reached the warehouse, Vincent could feel his pulse quickening. He'd been in situations like this before, but never with so much on the line. This was more than just an ambush, it was a challenge to his control, to his power in Glitter Town. And Vincent wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. He had fought too hard, bled too much, and sacrificed too many of his own to let it slip away now. As they approached the warehouse door, Vincent signaled for them to stop. The tension was suffocating, thick in the air as every man prepared for what might come next. The seconds stretched on, dragging out as they listened for any sounds of movement inside. The warehouse was eerily silent, but that only made Vincent more cautious. He knew that silence in this world was often the loudest thing of all. Without a word, Vincent moved forward, his feet light but purposeful as he approached the door. He paused, one hand on the handle, and looked over his shoulder at his men. They were ready. On my signal, Vincent whispered, his voice barely audible. We move in. And with that, they were ready. The trap was set. The game was about to enter its final phase. The door to the warehouse creaked as Vincent pushed it open, the sound cutting through the silence like a warning. The dim light from the nearby street lamps filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long, jagged shadows across the interior. For a moment it was hard to see anything clearly, just a vast expanse of darkened space, filled with the scent of old wood and rusting metal. The silence inside was suffocating, as though the very walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Vincent could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he kept his breathing steady, his focus absolute. He had learned long ago that fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. His men were close behind him, moving with practiced ease, staying low and silent as they followed his lead. The dim light from outside barely illuminated the massive, empty room, but Vincent didn't need to see everything. He could feel it, the tension in the air, the oppressive weight that told him they weren't alone. They had been walking into a trap since the first shot had been fired on the docks. The question now was who was waiting for them, and how many. As they crept further into the warehouse, Vincent's mind raced. The coldness of the space around him seemed to seep into his bones, but he pushed it aside. His thoughts were too focused on what could be lurking just beyond his sight. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every creak of the floorboards could signal the approach of someone ready to strike. But Vincent had a gift for sensing danger, and right now, everything inside him screamed that they were close to something. The question was whether they would catch it before it caught them. His eyes darted to the edges of the room, where large crates and old machinery loomed like silent sentinels. The faintest sounds, scraping metal, the shuffle of footsteps, echoed from somewhere in the dark, but they were too distant to pinpoint. Vincent motioned for his men to fan out, signaling them to cover the far corners of the warehouse. There were no clear signs of life yet, no direct confrontations. But Vincent knew this wasn't just some random place to lay low. Whoever had planned this knew that this was the perfect spot to ambush them, isolated, surrounded by walls that could keep any outside help from reaching them in time. As they advanced deeper into the shadows, Vincent's hand rested on the hilt of his gun, his fingers wrapped around the familiar grip, ready for anything. The tension in the air felt like it could snap at any moment, but the seconds stretched on, filled with nothing but silence. It was maddening, this quiet before the storm. Vincent's mind raced through possible scenarios. Was Salvatore Gallo behind this? Had he somehow orchestrated this entire situation to eliminate Vincent once and for all? It seemed like the most likely explanation. Sal had been patient, watching Vincent's rise from the sidelines, making strategic moves without revealing his full hand. But now, with the shots on the docks, with the ambush in the warehouse, it was as though Sal had decided to take the game to its inevitable conclusion. Vincent knew that the old man's pride wouldn't let him stand aside forever. Sal had built his empire with a careful, calculating hand. But Vincent had outgrown him. Outsmarted him. And now, here they were, on the brink of a confrontation that would either cement Vincent's dominance in Glitter Town or bury him under the weight of his own ambition. The group moved cautiously, covering the room in slow, deliberate steps. Each man scanned the shadows, checking every corner and crevice. There was no telling where an ambush could come from. Vincent knew better than to take any of it for granted. Suddenly, a loud crash broke the silence. A sharp sound, like metal against metal, echoed through the room, followed by the sound of running footsteps. It was coming from the far end, toward the back of the warehouse. Without a moment's hesitation, Vincent's men reacted, guns drawn, ready for the fight. The warehouse seemed to explode with energy as the team split off, converging on the sound, but Vincent held his ground, waiting, watching. He knew this moment would come. He had anticipated the confrontation, but he didn't want to move too quickly. Not yet. The footsteps grew louder, closer. A figure darted out from behind a stack of crates, moving with the speed of a predator. Vincent's eyes narrowed, and in the split second it took for him to recognize the figure, his body was already in motion. His gun was raised, and he fired, once, twice, each shot echoing through the vast, empty space. The figure dropped, a body crumpling to the ground. For a heartbeat, the room fell silent once again. Vincent's breath came in steady waves, his heart still racing. But now, there was no more hesitation. He motioned for his men to advance, and they moved like shadows, quick and silent, converging on the fallen figure. As they reached the body, Vincent's eyes locked onto the man lying on the cold concrete. He recognized him immediately. It was one of Sal's men, a familiar face from the old days, brash, impulsive, but always loyal. Vincent's mind raced. Why would Sal send his own men to ambush him like this? Had it been a test? A distraction? Or had Sal truly decided to eliminate Vincent once and for all? Before Vincent could get an answer, a voice from the darkness interrupted his thoughts. Well, the voice drawled, smooth and unsettling. It seems you found your first victim. Vincent froze, his gun still trained on the fallen man. The voice belonged to someone he hadn't heard in years, a man whose name had once carried weight in the underworld. A former ally, now turned enemy, and one of the few people who had the cunning to match Vincent's own. Marco? Vincent's voice was low, tinged with disbelief. The man who stepped into the dim light was grinning, his eyes glinting with a cold amusement. Surprised to see me, Vincent? I thought we had an understanding. You rise. I rise. But you've gotten too big for your britches, haven't you? Thought you could just waltz in here and take over like it was your birthright. Vincent's eyes narrowed. Marco had always been the wild card, the unpredictable element in their earlier dealings. A man who thrived on chaos, on making moves that no one could predict. But Vincent had never expected him to turn on him, especially not like this. You're working with Sal, then? Vincent asked, his voice tight, though his outward expression remained calm. Marco chuckled, stepping further into the light, the silhouette of a gun in his hand casting a shadow across the floor. Sal. Marco laughed again, louder this time. I'm working for no one. Least of all him. This is about me, Vincent. You've been too busy playing your game, but now it's time for mine. Vincent's eyes hardened, understanding now. Marco wasn't here to take over. He was here to prove something. To show that he could take down the empire Vincent had built, piece by piece, for his own gain. As the realization hit, Vincent felt the last shred of his patience snap. Marco had made a dangerous mistake. A fatal one. There was no turning back from this. Without warning, Vincent raised his gun again, his aim steady, and fired. The sound of the shot was muffled by the vast emptiness of the warehouse, but it was no less deadly. The bullet found its mark, and Marco collapsed, his body crumpling to the floor in a heap. The game had just taken another turn, and Vincent knew it would never be the same again. The air inside the warehouse felt thick, heavy with the aftermath of violence. Vincent stood over Marco's lifeless body, his hand still gripping the gun, his fingers tingling from the force of the shot. It was a moment of clarity, the kind that only came after the chaos had subsided, and the weight of the decision settled in. Marco was gone, just another casualty in a war that Vincent never intended to fight but had no choice but to engage in. The flickering of the old warehouse lights cast a ghostly glow over the scene, making it seem like something out of a dream, a nightmare that Vincent could barely shake off. He had seen men die before. He had made his own share of enemies, and those enemies had made him a killer. But something about Marco's death felt different. It wasn't just the fact that they had once been allies. It was the betrayal. It was the cold realization that, in the world Vincent had created, trust was as fleeting as the next breath. Marco had been one of his own, a man who had fought beside him, trusted him. And now, here he was, his body sprawled on the cold concrete floor, the blood pooling around him like a crimson stain on the empire they had both built. Vincent exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the chill of the warehouse. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. He had just killed a man who had once been his closest confidant, and in doing so, had sealed his own fate. There would be no turning back from this, no undoing the damage. The moment Marco had raised his hand against him, he had forfeited any chance at redemption. But Vincent knew that in this world, there was no such thing as redemption, not for men like him, not for men like Marco. Once you crossed that line, you were either a survivor or a casualty. Vincent's mind was racing. The attack on the docks, the ambush in the warehouse, it was all starting to fall into place. Salvatore Gallo's influence was still lurking in the shadows, but it wasn't Sal himself who had set the trap. It was Marco. Marco, who had been quietly maneuvering behind the scenes, pulling strings, making deals with those who would see Vincent fall. The old man, Sal, had always been shrewd, but Marco's betrayal proved that the younger generation of criminals was more dangerous than anyone could have predicted. They were hungry, ruthless, willing to cut down anyone who stood in their way, including their own. Vincent's hands were still shaking, the adrenaline from the gunfight and the rush of the kill still fresh in his veins. But he forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment now. There were still questions to be answered. Who else was involved? Was Marco working alone, or was there a larger conspiracy at play? And most importantly, where did Vincent go from here? A soft sound interrupted his thoughts, a rustling noise, followed by the sound of footsteps. Vincent's instincts kicked in immediately. He motioned for his men to fall back into position, his body tense as he waited for whatever was coming next. He hadn't been alone in the warehouse when the shot had been fired, and though he had no idea who might still be lurking in the shadows, he wasn't going to let his guard down. One of his men, a tall, quiet figure named Tony, stepped forward cautiously. "We got movement," Tony whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the warehouse lights. "There's someone still here. Near the back." Vincent nodded, his eyes scanning the area. His mind was still processing Marco's betrayal, but there was no time to dwell on it. The situation had escalated far beyond personal vendettas and old alliances. Whoever was still in the warehouse was either an ally or an enemy. And Vincent had no intention of finding out the hard way. "We move in," Vincent ordered, his voice calm but firm. "Stay close. And stay quiet." The men spread out, their movements synchronized, a well-rehearsed dance of survival. The warehouse had become a maze of crates, shadows, and broken equipment, and it was easy to get lost in its cavernous interior. But Vincent had been in places like this before, and he knew how to navigate the darkness. He led the way, his senses heightened, every sound magnified in the oppressive silence. They moved slowly, methodically, inching toward the source of the movement. Vincent's mind raced with possibilities, but there was only one certainty: whoever it was, they knew how to move in the shadows. This wasn't some random thug who had stumbled into the warehouse. This was someone with purpose. Someone with a plan. And Vincent was determined to find out who before it was too late. As they reached the back of the warehouse, the faintest glimmer of light flickered in the distance. It came from a small window, just high enough to be out of reach but still offering enough illumination to reveal the outline of a figure standing near the far wall. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and his face was hidden in the shadows. Vincent's breath caught in his chest. He had seen this man before. "Polly," Vincent said softly, his voice carrying across the stillness of the warehouse. The figure stiffened at the sound of his name, then slowly turned to face Vincent. The man's face was worn, his features hardened by years of service in the criminal underworld, but there was a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. He had once been one of Vincent's most trusted associates, a man who had worked alongside him in the early days, back when everything had seemed like an adventure rather than a battle for survival. But now, there was something different in Polly's eyes. Something cold, distant. "I didn't think you'd find me," Polly said, his voice low and measured, as if he had already accepted whatever was coming next. "I didn't want to be here, Vincent. But you know how it is. The money's good. Sal offered me a deal." Vincent's jaw tightened. "A deal? With Salvatore?" Polly nodded, his gaze shifting toward Marco's body, now a lifeless heap on the floor. "You've got too many enemies, Vincent. Too many people want a piece of you. Sal's just one of them. Marco? He was working both sides. But you've always known that, haven't you? You've always known that there's no loyalty in this world. Not when the money's on the table." Vincent's mind was racing. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the confrontation that had been building for years. Polly's betrayal wasn't a surprise, not really. Vincent had known that this day would come, the day when everyone he had trusted would either fall in line or make their move. But the cold reality of it, the way Polly had turned on him so easily, still stung. The world of crime wasn't just dangerous because of the violence. It was dangerous because it turned men like Polly into creatures who only cared about survival. And Polly had chosen his side. He had chosen Sal. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Neither man moved. Vincent could see the fear in Polly's eyes, hidden beneath the bravado, and he knew that fear was what had driven him to make his deal with Sal. Fear of Vincent's power. Fear of what might happen if he didn't act now. Vincent exhaled slowly, his gun still trained on Polly. "You're with him now, huh? You've picked your side. Just like Marco." Polly's expression hardened. "I didn't have a choice." "That's where you're wrong," Vincent said, his voice cold and final. "You always have a choice. And now, you've made yours." Without warning, Vincent pulled the trigger, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. Polly didn't even have time to react. He crumpled to the ground, a lifeless body joining the others that had fallen in Vincent's wake. For a moment, the only sound in the warehouse was the ringing in Vincent's ears. He stood there, staring at the bodies around him, the weight of his decisions settling in. There would be no more betrayals. No more games. The endgame was here, and there was no turning back. Vincent's eyes scanned the room, the dead weight of the moment settling over him like a thick fog. Polly's body lay crumpled on the cold concrete floor, his betrayal, his final breath, a bitter reminder of how far the web of deceit had spread. The faint glow from the distant street lamps outside flickered like dying stars against the darkness that enveloped the warehouse. The silence that followed the shot seemed almost unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The men around him didn't speak. They had seen it all before, and though they might have felt something beneath their hardened exteriors, they didn't show it. Vincent had trained them well in that respect. The world they lived in wasn't one where emotions could take root. Loyalty was bought and sold with blood, and trust was something that, once given, was almost always taken away. The violence that was etched into the bones of every man in that room was a fact of life. They didn't question it, they didn't have the luxury. Vincent's mind, however, was a different story. His hand still trembled ever so slightly around the grip of his gun, the action from earlier still fresh in his body, the adrenaline ebbing away. But this wasn't like the first time. The first time he had taken a life, it had felt like an accident. Like the world had moved in a way he hadn't expected, and he had to adapt quickly to survive. But each death since had felt different, less like a mistake, more like an inevitability. With Polly, there had been no hesitation, no inner struggle. The moment Vincent realized where his loyalties lay, it was over. Polly had betrayed him, and the price for betrayal was always the same in this world. It wasn't just a matter of business, it was personal. Polly had known him too well, had seen his rise and the cost of that rise. He had seen the transformation from a hungry man willing to bend the rules, to a man who now ruled with cold, calculated precision. As Vincent's eyes lingered on Polly's body, the room around him seemed to grow quieter, more suffocating. The dim lighting made the shadows seem deeper, as though the corners of the warehouse were conspiring against him, hiding things he wasn't ready to see. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of secrets, betrayals, lies, debts owed, and decisions made that could never be undone. It was a world Vincent had become accustomed to, but it was never one he truly wanted to inhabit. He shifted his weight and finally spoke, breaking the silence that had clung to the space like dust in the air. "Check the perimeter," he told Tony, his voice low but firm. "And keep your eyes open. I want to know exactly who we're dealing with here." Tony nodded without a word and moved toward the edges of the warehouse, his form vanishing into the shadows with the ease of someone used to the dark. The rest of the men, ever watchful, kept their positions, alert and ready for whatever might come next. Vincent's mind, though, was elsewhere. The kill was already done, and with it, Polly's chapter was closed. But the broader game was still playing out, and Vincent knew that he was no closer to the answers he needed than he had been hours ago. Salvatore Gallo's hand still loomed large over everything, but something about this felt different. Sal's power, his empire, it wasn't just about money. It was about control. And if Vincent was to take Glitter Town for himself, to build something that would last, he had to be the one in control, not just of the streets, but of the narrative itself. But the deeper he got into this world, the harder it became to distinguish where survival ended and paranoia began. Every face around him could be hiding a secret, and every handshake could be hiding a knife. Trust, once broken, was never fully repaired. Marco had proved that. Polly had proved that. And even now, as he stood among his men, there was a part of him that wondered just how much of what he had built was really his at all. The sound of footsteps returned, more hurried this time. Tony emerged from the shadows, his face tight with urgency. "Boss, we've got company." A couple of cars parked outside. No sign of who's inside, but we're not alone here. Vincent's instincts flared, his mind shifting from contemplation to action in an instant. He motioned for his men to gather closer, his voice steady as he issued orders. "Get to the back exit. We'll move out and see who's interested in paying us a visit tonight. I don't care who it is. We're not playing their game." The tension in the air thickened. It was clear that whoever was out there wasn't here to make a friendly visit. The mere presence of cars outside was proof enough that this wasn't just a coincidence. Vincent had learned long ago to trust his gut, and right now, it told him that whoever was on the other side of that door wasn't there for small talk. "Stay sharp," Vincent said, his voice cold, his eyes never leaving the exit. "And don't let anyone get the jump on you. We're not backing down from this." His men moved swiftly, the sound of footsteps muffled against the concrete as they took their positions. The plan was simple: get out of the warehouse, find out who was lurking, and make sure they didn't get away with anything that would come back to haunt them. Vincent wasn't about to let another betrayal slip through his fingers, especially not now. As the team made their way toward the back, Vincent's mind raced through possible scenarios. He had no idea who these newcomers were, but he wasn't about to take any chances. It could be Sal's men, trying to make a move while he was distracted. Or it could be someone else entirely, someone with their own agenda. In this world, the only certainty was that nothing was ever what it seemed. The cold air from the open exit hit Vincent's face as they approached. He could feel the weight of the night pressing in on him, the dark sky above a vast sea of uncertainty. This wasn't just about surviving another confrontation, it was about sending a message. He wasn't afraid of what was out there. What he feared most was the creeping doubt that he had no control over it anymore. That the world was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how tightly he held on, he couldn't stop it from crumbling. Vincent pushed the thought aside, forcing himself to focus. The moment of truth was coming, and he would be ready. The game had changed again, and in this world, it always did. But as long as he was breathing, as long as he had his gun, Vincent knew he could always find a way to win. Because the truth was simple: in the end, you either ruled the streets or the streets ruled you. And Vincent wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. Vincent paced the length of the warehouse, his mind buzzing with the weight of Tony's words. Enemies were everywhere, hidden in plain sight, waiting for their moment to strike. It wasn't just Salvatore anymore. The entire network of alliances, favors, and loyalties that he had meticulously crafted over the years had begun to unravel. The cold air bit at his skin, but Vincent barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed with survival. Who else could he trust? How many more of his men had been bought or betrayed? He had known that power was fragile, but the extent of the conspiracy was beyond what he could have imagined. The shadows in the warehouse seemed to grow longer, stretching out like the fingers of ghosts trying to pull him into the darkness. But Vincent was no stranger to the darkness. He had thrived in it. Still, he knew that this time it wasn't just about power. It was about loyalty, about the price of betrayal. And as much as he hated it, Vincent knew that in the end, he would have to fight for his life, not just his empire. With a grim resolve, he turned toward his men. There was no turning back now. The war for Glitter Town had only just begun. Vincent stood on the edge of the city, staring out at the skyline of Glitter Town. The faint hum of the streets below seemed far away now, almost like a distant memory. His thoughts were clouded, each one a tangled mess of regret, ambition, and the crushing weight of the choices that had brought him here. This was the moment that would define him, the final act in a play he hadn't fully understood until now. He had no illusions left. The people he had trusted, the empire he had built, had all been part of a carefully constructed illusion. In the end, it had all come down to one thing: survival. But survival was a fragile thing. The underworld he had risen from was ruthless, and there was no place for weakness, no room for sentimentality. Vincent had learned that lesson the hard way. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. Inside, he was numb. He knew what he had to do now. The lines had been drawn, and he was on his own. Whatever happened next, he would face it alone, without allies, without friends, just the man he had become and the dark path ahead of him. Vincent stood motionless, his heart beating heavy in his chest as the night around him seemed to close in tighter. The weight of his choices pressed down, suffocating him. He had faced countless challenges, but none had ever felt like this. Betrayal had always been a shadow lurking in the corners of his life, but now it was the very air he breathed. The streets of Glitter Town had once felt like a kingdom, his kingdom. But now, they seemed more like a labyrinth, each turn and corner filled with more danger than the last. He could feel the storm coming, the ones who had once called him king now turning their backs, waiting for the right moment to strike. The realization settled in like cold steel against his skin: he was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. And yet, in that dark moment, there was no fear. No hesitation. Only a quiet, burning resolve. The empire he had built might be crumbling, but Vincent wasn't done. Not yet. The fight was far from over. His next move would be crucial, the stakes higher than ever. But whatever it took, he would keep his name alive, no matter the cost. The cold grip of reality tightened around Vincent as the final pieces of his empire fell away. The city that had once sung his praises now whispered his demise. Glitter Town, the very place he had bled to build, was no longer his. It was a place filled with ghosts of his past, old friends turned enemies, and allies who had vanished like smoke in the wind. As the night grew deeper and the streets darker, Vincent stood at the crossroads of his life. Every decision, every betrayal, every move he had made had led him here, to this moment of reckoning. There were no more grand gestures, no more daring plays for power. The empire he had forged with grit and cunning had crumbled like sand slipping through his fingers. And yet, in the silence of the night, a flicker of resolve remained within him. Though his reign was over, his fight was far from finished. As long as he drew breath, Vincent Caravetta would never fully surrender. His legacy might have been written in blood, but it was far from complete. The final chapter had yet to be written, only time would tell if it would end with redemption, vengeance, or oblivion. But for now, one thing was certain: Vincent's story was far from finished.